Okay, we got 1 minute to go, so I'm gonna test the microphone and make sure that it's working.
You guys back for one more something?
One's gonna get to, we got one later.
The number 2 team.
Did they really? But they weren't that good.
They were, their defense was gonna get through. Yes. Nice. We got an interception and gave up. Like 2
Shocker. I feel like it's like freshman, sophomore year, yeah. That's what I thought, cause I'm like, last year, the freshman class, they were all for football, like homecoming, huge, got really big into it. And this year, kind of this current freshman class, they've got super into it, so they put some good life into it.
So great. Every day.
I'm having a hard time getting this to come out, so I apologize.
He interacts with all the students at the game.
Delay. Just don't want it to not record, and then I have this whole hour-long thing of
Just transferred to Texas.
I had a class with them. Basketball coaching class. A bunch of the basketball players are in. So, you know, the dream for 3 hours for them, because their coach was the professor.
Yeah, that class.
It was cool. You got to do a bunch of drills and play knockout and stuff. That's fun.
Oh, yeah, I was calling Jaden this year after the season.
somebody log on to my channel. For some reason, it's not coming up on my phone, and see if it's. Yeah. Just sat around on the tracker.
He was playing really well. Tournament.
Maybe it's gonna come up now.
Yeah, I thought they did it like decently.
I kept up and I never won.
Yep, all right, so we have sound. Very good. So we talked about ancient thought last time, just as sort of a reminder. One of the things that students often ask is, why is it that we're talking about these guys from 5,000, years ago, that or 2,500 years ago in the case of Socrates and Aristotle, that don't seem to have any real connection to the modern world, right? Although if you read Aristotle, you really do get the sense that because he was a scientist, that he has something relevant to say about the modern world. And so his philosophy is virtue ethics. Now, of all of the philosophies that we talk about, this is the only one that is holistic, in that it doesn't give you a prescription for how to act based on rules or principles, but rather tries to transform the individual into a better person. And that's the whole goal of Aristotle's virtue. And we talked about how Aristotle's virtue is based totally on this idea of the golden mean. So what we saw, if you look at Aristotle's body of work as a whole, I think what you see is this movement towards this golden mean or middle ground, right? So it's not that there's anything wrong with certain types of friendship, but there's perfected friendship, which is you're recognizing that these are the friends of a lifetime. There are very few of them. It's sort of the middle between the extremes of being either based on utility or pleasure, right? And you see this in Aristotle's The Politics with this sort of really nothing wrong with either monarchy or, again, good governments and bad governments of one, a few, and many. Nothing wrong with these other than they are more likely, so you have monarchy, aristocracy, polity, tyranny, oligarchy, and then democracy. And this one, according to Aristotle, is probably the least likely to degenerate into the bad form. And we see this in history. I mean, Aristotle's sort of prophetic. He's, way before Henry VIII. And Henry VIII starts out as an enlightened monarch who is a humanist. And what he becomes is something else. And so it's this, because this is sort of the middle ground, you have enough people that it's likely that if one of them starts to go crazy, the others will say things like, let's not do that. Let's not go down that path. But you don't have so many that it's easy to persuade them through the use of demagoguery into going into a really, really bad path, right? So virtue ethics attempts to achieve this balance. And it's the only one of the theories that we study that does this, that tries to make you a better person. Well, how do we do that? Well, the first thing that we have to do, according to Aristotle, is we have to determine what is the purpose of a human life? What is the end? What is the terminus ad quem of a human life? So if you see me out walking across campus one day and you say, where are you going? And I say, I'm going to the doctor. And you say, well, why are you going to the doctor? Well, because I need to have a physical. Well, why do you want to have a physical? Well, because I want to make sure that, everything's working and that I'm in good. I'm 51 years old. This is the age at which things start to fall apart. I want to make sure that I'm in good physical shape. Well, why do you want to make sure you're well, because I want to live, right? That's the terminus ad quem, the point at which it no longer makes sense to say why. I was a why child. I would ask why until it became obnoxious to my parents. And my mother would become exasperated and she would say something like, Grant, you can't ride a dead horse. And I would say, no, but you can sit on it for a while, right? And so I would always ask why. Well, why can't I do that? Why can't I have the cookie before dinner? Well, because you'll spoil your appetite. Why? Well, why does that matter? Well, because a cookie is just empty calories and it's not, like providing the nutrition you need. Well, why do I need that? Well, ultimately, because you want to thrive, right? So determining the purpose of a human life. Well, what is the purpose of a human life? According to Aristotle, it is, in the ancient Greek, he says, it's the eudaimonic life. Eudaimonia. Eudaimoni. Well, a lot is going to rely on how we interpret this word. What is the general interpretation of the translation of this word into English? Well, it's happiness. But I don't think we can take this as in happiness, like let's drink up, let's have another round. It's something more than that. I think Daniel Robinson says that the good translation of the eudaimonic life is actually the flourishing life. And what we see in Aristotle is a flourishing life. In the Nicomachean Ethics and in the Eudamian Ethics, he asks this question, what is the purpose of a human being? And we get two different answers. And they're sort of diametrically opposed. In one, he says that the flourishing life is the life of the good lawgiver. The life of the good lawgiver is the active life. And in the other, he says it's the contemplative life. It's the life of the philosopher. If we combine these and we look for the golden mean, what we see is Aristotle's life. This is a guy who is out there advising Alexander the Great. But he's also studying the cuttlefish and coming up with the way we classify things largely in the scientific world. So we see the foundations in Aristotle of the way we classify the natural world into kingdom, phyla, genus, species, right? That starts with Aristotle. This is a guy who is living both the active life and also a contemplative life. It is this balance, this extreme between, this means between two extremes. If we take an extreme defective character, what's an extreme defective character? Well, cowardice, right? The coward is somebody who always runs away from a fight. What's the opposite of cowardice? Well, it's heedlessness. This is somebody who's always willing to fight, no matter the cost. What's the middle ground? Courage. The courageous person knows when to fight the good fight. It's this balance and proportionality that we look at. And this is the only one. The others tell us how to behave in discrete situations. Aristotle tries to make us into a better person. Now, what are some of the criticisms of virtue ethics? There are all of the theories that we study will have problems. They will all have issues. One criticism of Aristotle's virtue ethics is, how do you determine the purpose of a human life? I think he comes up with a pretty good formulation for this. Although, there are people who would say that ultimately, if you believe in a deity, that maybe the worship of that deity is the purpose and end of a human life, the worshiping of that deity. For most of Christianity, Mary Kay Ash, who starts Mary Kay Cosmetics. If you go to Dallas, you can see the headquarters of Mary Kay. I went to Dallas one time and I stayed at the Anatole, which is my favorite hotel in all of Dallas, and they were having the Mary Kay convention. I have never been surrounded by so many pink Cadillacs in all my life. I mean, and if you have a pink Cadillac, you've made millions of dollars in Mary Kay. And Mary Kay built her business on this idea of God first, family second, work third. Right? If you might believe that. I think Aristotle actually comes up with a better definition. The flourishing life is, again, why did the ancient Greeks not turn to the worship of it? These are messy characters. Zeus is coming down and having children. These are demigods, and they're messy, right? The Greek gods were messy. They're not who you're turning to for the ultimate questions of life, which is why the Greeks tend to answer things with philosophy rather than theology or mythology. Even if you can determine what the virtues are, how do we determine what these virtues are? And even if you can determine them, how can we know that we can teach them? This is probably, of the three criticisms, the hardest. Can they be taught? We try to do this from a very early age. How do you first learn about ethics? Well, you first learn about ethics in terms of reward and punishment. But we also try in kindergarten, the first thing that you learn, one of the first lessons you learn, is that sharing is caring, right? You gotta share. If you have a birthday, I never got to experience this because my birthday is July 1st. So my birthday is always in the summer. I never got to experience having a birthday party at school. But all my friends who had birthdays from, the middle of August until the end of May got to experience having a birthday party at school when we were in elementary school. By the time you get to high school, they don't really do that. But, in elementary, they do. And their mom would bring cupcakes. You have to bring cupcakes for even, in the Peanuts cartoon, there's this character Pigpen who, you gotta bring even for Pigpen, right? Because sharing is caring. We try to instill these virtues at an early age. I don't know that we can. But again, if we go back to Socrates and Plato, you don't need the philosopher to tell you what can be done. You need the philosopher to tell you what you should do and what the best is that you can become. You don't need the philosopher to tell you what's actually, that's the business of the sociologist or the psychologist to tell us whether or not this, that's somebody else's business. The business of philosophy is to tell us what's the best that we can become. So those are ancient theories, Socrates and Plato, Republic, Aristotle's virtue ethics. What are the modern theories? When does modernity begin? If I asked you that question, when does modernity begin? So here you have a chance to get a duck. When do you think modernity begins? Yes.
The Industrial Revolution.
You think it begins in the
Or
Industrial
modern.
Revolution? Okay, well, take a duck. That's wrong, but good guess. And I think the reason that most people guess the Industrial Revolution is because this is such a momentous event that it really, or a period of time in which the means of production change radically. And for most of human history before the Industrial Revolution, goods and services were very scarce, right? They were on a very limited basis. And so you produced small quantities of things, and it was very difficult to get things from one place to another. The earliest studies in marketing start about the Industrial Revolution. So marketing as an activity has ancient origins. We don't know when the first society began. We don't know when that happened. We have some ideas, right? I mean, that it popped up around the Fertile Crescent and maybe, about 5,000 years ago, according to the anthropological and archaeological record. We have echoes of this in the Bible, for example, but we don't really, we don't know exactly when the first society began. But when that first society starts, what we do know is that marketing as an activity occurred, right? People started to specialize, but it was very, very limited. So the Industrial Revolution is a good guess. You were going to guess something else.
Enlightenment.
The Enlightenment. Okay, that's also a very good guess. You can have a duck. Also wrong. The Enlightenment is obviously this era in which, and again, you could certainly see why we would think that modernity from our perspective would start with the Enlightenment. This is the time in which we recognize that maybe government should be formed by the people and not ordained by God. And so that's a very modern theory. Anybody else have a guess? Yes.
Maybe after death.
After death is when modernity begins. Like when we die, we become fully modern, like the soul and the spirit.
No, like
Like AD.
like AD.
Oh, okay. So you think modernity begins in Anno Domini, which Anno Domini doesn't stand for after death. That means in the year of our Lord. Right. So there's BC, which is before Christ, and then there's AD, which is Anno Domini, which is in the year of our Lord. Modern historians refer to that as BCE, before the Common Era, and then CE, the Common Era. So that's a good guess, right? Because this is sort of when we have history. So that's a good guess. You can get a duck as well. Most historians think that the modern era began in the Quattrocento, which is the 15th century. And they begin with a number of things that happened. the writings of Niccolo, the first modern man, according to most historians, is Niccolo Bernardo de Machiavelli. Machiavelli's most famous work, the one that he is remembered for, and the one that I think he gets a bad rap for, is a book called The Prince. But you read The Prince and you see why he is modern in this work. If you want to read a work of philosophy that's very short, read The Prince. It's very pithy. You can read it in one sitting. And what we get in The Prince is how power actually works, rather than a focus on what we should be doing and a focus on a belief in the divine right of kings and government being ordained by God. What we see is Machiavelli divorcing power and government from theology. And that's what makes it thoroughly modern, is this separating of government and politics from the divine. Up until that point, the belief system was that governments were ordained by God. Now, The Prince is a very mechanistic application of power. And he writes it, Machiavelli writes it for one person. It's for an audience of one. He never intended this to be his greatest work. He probably thought of his greatest work as being a history of Florence or the discourses on the first 12 books of Titus Livy. What we see in The Prince is Machiavelli says, look, there are two types of governments. There are basically principalities or monarchies, and there are republics. I'm not going to talk about republics because I talk about those somewhere else. And he hadn't actually finished the discourses on the first 12 books of Titus Livy at the time. So it's kind of unusual that he would say that, but he was working on that, and that is probably his greatest work. And the Machiavelli of the discourses is radically different from the Machiavelli of The Prince. So Machiavelli says in The Prince, he's writing it to Lorenzo de Medici, who is come to power, and Machiavelli has lost his position in government, and he's trying to get it back. And so he writes this book dedicated to the Medici and an attempt to get it back. He had a position in government when Florence was a republic. The Medici come back to power, and he's trying to regain his status. And it is just the raw exercise of power. So Machiavelli says, for example, that morality for the prince is different than morality for you or I. The whole purpose of the prince is to maintain the state and to maintain power. And so if the prince, for example, has to lie and cheat and steal, that's perfectly acceptable, so long as he protects the state. Now, he says there are different ways people become a prince. There are different ways that you can be born into it. And depending on how you come to power is going to influence how you have to behave. If you are a native of the place in which you become a prince, if you are born into it, it's much easier than if you're not. If you take over a state, much more difficult, particularly if you're not a native of that area. Why? People don't like to be controlled from outside forces. So you're going to have to be far more ruthless in those instances in order to maintain power. And if that means that you have to kill people, well, then so be it. That's just the cost of doing business. So it depends on how you become a prince, how you maintain power, right? But it's just this brutal exercise of power. The second thing that makes the Quattrocento modern is the printing press. All of a sudden, we have the ability to disseminate information widely. Before the printing press, well, what was the book that was most widely disseminated? It was the Bible. And how did how did they come up with the Bible? Well, it was monks copying. There are very ancient versions of the Bible that are beautifully illustrated because they're hand copied and illustrated. Now, with the invention of the printing press, you can disseminate information really, really widely, right? So that's the second thing that makes it modern. And then the third thing is the discovery of the New World. So all of this takes place about that period of time, which is the Renaissance, and that's the beginning of modernity. What do we get from Machiavelli? Well, Machiavelli's ethics in The Prince are pretty suspect. His ethics in the discourses, which I think is what he should be remembered for, are more long-lasting. Again, remember that philosophy answers three questions. What is it I can know, and how can I know it? The question of knowledge, which is epistemology and metaphysics. The question of conduct, which we call ethics, and the question of governance, right? So with regard to governance, Machiavelli picks up on this idea of republicanism from from Socrates and Plato, and he comes up with this, in Republic, in the discourses, his form of republicanism is the Roman Republic, which is based on the ancient Greek, which is there are elements of monarchy, elements of aristocracy, and elements of democracy. And you have that in the Roman Republic. You have the elements of monarchy being the consuls, which are two people, right? So you have Caesar and Pompey, for example, that were the consuls. And then you have the aristocracy, which is the Roman Senate, and then you have elements of democracy, which are tribunes who are popularly elected and sort of settle disputes among the masses. So you see this question of governance in Machiavelli and The Prince, and then in also the discourses. I think the discourses are his more complete work and his more thorough thought. The Prince was just written for one person, really, but it's become what he is mostly known for. So then what do we get from modern thought, beginning with Machiavelli? What are the modern ethical theories? Well, there is utilitarianism. This is expanded or proposed by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and it's the one that business students like the most. Now, one of the things we have to remember, again, there are problems with Aristotle's virtue ethics, right? Can we teach these ethics? I'm not sure that we can. It's not clear to me that we can, but we try, and we should try to teach these virtues. So the problems with utilitarianism, again, this is a valid theory. So when you write your essays, one of the things that I tell you that you have to do on the first exam is you have to use a valid ethical theory. What are the valid ethical theories that you can use? Well, you can use virtue. You can use utilitarian. You can use duty ethics or deontological ethics. This is also called, utilitarianism is called teleological, because it focuses on the end. Duty is also called deontological because it focuses on duty. You can use virtue, utility, duty, or moral minimum. Lots of textbooks will tell you that the moral minimum is the law. That's wrong. It's a priori wrong because the law itself may be immoral. And so you can't use the law. I mean, the law is an important consideration, but you have to use something other than the law because the law itself, as evidenced by, for example, in the United States that we had for many, many years, a system of slavery. And then when slavery ended, we came up with this system of what was called separate but equal, which was put forth in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, and it wasn't until Brown versus the Board of Education of Kansas that we overturned that. So the law itself may be immoral. So you can use virtue, utility, duty, a moral minimum. Now, all of these have problems with them. What makes them different from the challenges to ethics that we talked about, subjectivism, cultural relativism, and psychological egoism, is those are fundamentally flawed because they are based on emotion. They are not based on logic, and therefore you cannot universalize them, right? You cannot develop universal principles or rules out of them. So the exact opposite is what makes these theories ethically valid, in that they are based on logic, they're not based on emotion, and they allow for the universal development of rules, right? You can't make universal rules if you said subjectivism allows for everybody to determine for themselves what is ethical. We can't do that. Or if we say that, you know, cultural relativism is it's all group-based, well, you know, what's good in California is, you know, good for Californians, and what's good in Oklahoma, well, there are things that we should say that we're not going to vote on, whether or not it's California or Oklahoma. Separate but equal was the law of the land in the South. It was a priori wrong. We're not going to, you know, allow for the separation in that instance, right? So it's not that these don't have, it's not that virtue ethics doesn't have problems, or that utilitarianism doesn't have problems. It's that they are at least based on a rational application of ideas. They are not emotive, and they are therefore universally applicable. We can come up with universal rules. So again, with Aristotle, we can say, look, we should encourage courage. We should encourage people to be compassionate. What is the compassionate person? Well, there's the draconian person, the person who is always willing to, you know, cut off with their head. This is like Alice in Wonderland. How many of you have seen Alice in Wonderland, right? You've all have heard the story, right? The Queen of Hearts, off with their head. Garnishy first, trial after. That's bad. Then there's the, well, let everybody go. We can't do that. But the compassionate person knows when to exercise good judgment. To say there are exceptions to this, right? And we acknowledge there are exceptions. Murder is the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. Well, that's an elements test. It recognizes that there may be lawful killings of human beings. What do we generally say are lawful killings of human beings? Defense of self. What?
Self-defense.
Yeah, you get a duck. Self-defense. What else is a lawful killing of a human being? Anybody else?
War.
War. You get a duck. That's another one. What's another lawful killing of a human being?
Unethical, but like an accidental killing, like a
Okay.
car accident.
Yep, right. We recognize that they're just accident. We don't charge people generally unless you're drunk, right? We don't charge you with manslaughter or something like that if you get in a car wreck. If you just can't slam on the brake fast enough and you go barreling through the red light and you're stone cold sober and you're not on the phone, we don't charge you with a crime, because we recognize that, you know, if we did that, it would ultimately lead to bad results, which is nobody would drive. If every time somebody, you know, I mean, if you could be held liable every time somebody died in a car wreck, nobody would take that risk, right? That would be bad. So yes, there are accidental deaths. Those are not unlawful killings. We generally excuse those. If you happen to crash the plane and you kill people, well, that's an accidental death, and we generally excuse that. Defense of others is generally another lawful killing. If you were protecting your family, for example, from an intruder who breaks in. That's a lawful killing, right? So we recognize that there are these exceptions to these rules. So, non-emotive, based on reason, allows for universal application, right? So with virtue ethics, we can say things like, compassion is generally a good thing. Courage is generally a good thing that we want to teach people to do. Industry, right? One of the things with regard to can we teach virtue ethics that we find is that Benjamin Franklin actually did this. He became his own thought experiment. He comes up with 13 virtues. And he puts them down on a piece of ivory, and every day if he sort of didn't get one right, he would put what we call a box, and he knew there was more work to do. Why did he have 13? Well, if you multiply 13 times 4, you come up with what? 52. How many weeks are there in a year? 52. So you can get through 4 complete cycles. It's why, historically speaking, before you all were born, it used to be that sitcoms and television shows were 13 episodes, because you could have a fall lineup, a spring lineup, and then you could go through 2 rounds of reruns in the summer, right? So 52. So 4, you get a duck, since you came up with the correct mathematical answer quickly. You had 4 complete cycles. He would work on it and became his own psychological experiment, and did from all outward appearances change his life and become better than what he was. He noticed early on that he had certain leadership characteristics, but he also noticed that he was leading people into fights and scrapes that he probably shouldn't have done. And he set about reforming himself. And so he comes up with these 13 virtues, and he tries to live by these 13 virtues. And by all outward appearances, Franklin was a success at this. He's the only founding father, by the way, that we know of by his nickname, Ben Franklin. You don't say Tom Jefferson, right? Or Georgie Washington. But we do know Franklin. He's, in many respects, our favorite founding father.
Especially on the bill he's on.
Well, he's on the $100 bill, right? And a lot of people think that only people who were presidents were on bills. Franklin was never president of the United States. He's on the $100 bill. Alexander Hamilton was never president of the United States in this on currency, right? A lot of them are people that were president. That George Washington's on the first, the $1 bill, right? So with regard to utilitarianism, based on reason, not emotive, can you be universally applicable, right? So what is utilitarianism? What is utilitarian ethics? Well, this is the one that business students like the most, because it's the one that you are most familiar with, because it's predicated on the maximization of utility, which is an economic idea, right? So economists talk about the maximization. So if you want to get a really worthless degree, get a degree in economics, they just rename stuff that we all understand intuitively with fascinating terms like maximization of utility. What is the maximization of utility? Well, it's basically getting the most bang for your buck. You want to stretch your dollar. You all probably have jobs. That's one of the things that I've noticed. When I was a liberal arts professor, all of those people, none of those people over there had jobs, right? Because they didn't have useful skills. Philosophy is a totally useless degree program in terms of getting a job. What are you going to do with it? Well, I can sit around and think below this position. Political science, what are you going to do with that? Well, you can go to law school. That's why I got a degree in political science, was so I could go to law school. It's the #1 degree for people who want to go to law school, is political science. So you get a degree in that. You can't do anything with it. You can't get a job. You have to go to law school in order to get a job, right? So economists talk about the maximization of utility, which is I want to stretch my dollar as far as I can. I want to get the most for that as I possibly can. And there's this theory called the free hand of the, the invisible hand of the market, which is the idea that those people who are willing to pay the most for a good or service will put it to the highest and best use. Sort of works, not really, but okay. But a lot of our business courses are predicated on this idea of the maximization of utility, getting the most bang for your buck. Well, instead of, in ethical terms, instead of getting the most bang for your buck, what we want to do is we want to create the greatest happiness for the most people. Not the greatest happiness for me or my tribe, but the greatest happiness overall. Under this theory, actions are ethical based on results. And so this is the basis of capitalism. You buy your laptop computer and you put it to the highest and best use in terms of coming to class and taking notes on it, using it to research stuff for your term papers and things like that. And isn't that wonderful? Now, what's wrong with the maximization of happiness? Creating the greatest happiness for the most number of people. Again, it's non-emotive because in every interaction, what you have to do is you have to determine what is going to produce the greatest happiness for the most number of people. Why is it that I'm standing up here yapping at you about stuff that you would rather probably not think about? Because it's hard. Like ethics is hard. Philosophy is hard to think about. Aristotle says, all men by their very nature desire to know. And I really question that sometimes with my students. Really question it. Because it seems to me that education is the one thing that the less you get of it, the more happy you are. If I get sick and don't show up for class, students are just ecstatic that they got a day off. Less is more. Right? What's wrong with this idea of creating the greatest happiness for the most number of people? Can you think of anything wrong with that? Yeah.
Not everybody gets happy at the same things.
Okay, how do we determine what is overall happiness? You get another duck. I may want things done to me that you don't want done to you. So my brother, and I was horrified at this to begin with, my brother got a dog collar for his dogs to train them, and I was sort of horrified by it. And one of the things they tell you is that if you're going to use the dog collar, you have to shock yourself with the dog collar to see what you're doing, right, to the animal, so that you're supposed to shock yourself. And I was sort of horrified by this. Well, my niece became sort of fascinated by this, and she kept after me about wanting to like shock me with it. I'm like, I'm never going to use the dog collar because I just don't believe in them, right? And she finally convinced me that like she shocks me with the dog collar, and it's become a fun little game. We see like how much you can take. You shock yourself with the dog collar and see who can get to the highest level of shocking with the dog collar. I can get it to full power, depending on the part of your body that you put it on. If you put it on the bottom of your foot, you can hardly, like even at 10, which is the highest setting, you can hardly feel it because there's like your skin on the bottom of your feet is pretty thick, right? So, you know, I mean, like, most people would think of that as being just absolutely horrific. But it, you know, I mean, you do kind of have to, in order to, if you're going to use this, you really do need to understand what you're doing to the animal. I generally think you shouldn't use them, to be honest with you. That's my position, but, you know, they sell a lot of these, right? And, you know, I don't know. Let's think about one of the things that you have when you live in a densely populated area is people complain about dogs barking. And if your dogs bark too much, for example, my brother lives in Plano, so he has a part of the dog collar's function is that if the dog barks, it will shock the dog so that they don't bark when they're outside, right? Now, there are two ways you can do, if you have a dog that barks, which he has 2 dogs that bark a lot, if they don't have the dog collar on, you can either use the dog collar, or the city of Plano will come and they will tell you that you either have to get rid of the dogs, or you can surgically snip the dog's vocal cords and basically prevent them from barking, right? Which is worse? I don't know. I don't know. You know, surgically altering a creature or putting the dog collar on so that when they go out in the backyard, they don't bark. I don't know. I don't know how you measure that, right? Which is one of the problems with utilitarianism. It's like, how do you measure this? How do you measure that? So you're correct. I may want things done to me that you don't want to do. How do you determine what's happiness? What people like is, you know, radically different based on the individual. You know? What else could be a problem with utilitarianism?
Just if you have tons of power and you like things a certain way, but you can cause others lots of pain for your gain.
Yeah, that wouldn't be ethical according to utilitarian, because it's that is Machiavelli's The Prince, right? But that wouldn't be ethical. I mean, like, the fact that you have power doesn't mean that you're an ethical person. Now, Machiavelli would say that as long as you're maintaining the state, that's okay. As long as you are promoting, and I think the reason that Machiavelli says that this is okay is that ultimately he feels in The Prince, not in the discourses. Again, we have to distinguish between the Machiavelli of The Prince and the Machiavelli of the discourses, that the maintenance of the state is the highest good. Because ultimately the maintenance of the state and the principality leads to stability, and overall, I think you could tease out that is the highest good. But no, I think a lot of utilitarians would say no. You can do a lot of bad things, and that's not necessarily ethical. But you can have a duck for coming up with that. I think one of the big criticisms of utilitarianism, and the one that seems to me to be the most valid, is that the ends don't always justify the means. So I think I told you all at one point in time that CNN did a special on how ethical is the chocolate in your Easter basket. We're coming up on the second largest chocolate buying day of the year. It's my mother's birthday. It's Halloween, October 31st. So it's one of my favorite holidays. My mother always made a big deal out of Halloween because she was born on it, and she would make these elaborate costumes for my brother and I. We won. They hated us at school during Halloween because my mother would hand make these costumes, and they were always the best costumes. I mean, they just were elaborate. We didn't ever buy. There was no store-bought costume. So she would spend a month or two before making us these costumes, and we would win every year at the costume contest at school. Second largest chocolate buying day worldwide is Halloween. The first is Easter. Turns out that a very small number of people are actually enslaved to make most of the world's chocolate. Aren't we all happier because we have chocolate? You could enslave a small number of people to produce I mean, like, we know when you eat the chocolate that the portion of the brain that senses pleasure starts firing. And aren't we all like, when you have the Hershey's bar or the Reese's peanut butter cups, what's your favorite? What's your favorite candy? What's your favorite chocolate? Snickers. I love Snickers. Actually, there's a whole study on how Snickers is like the perfect candy bar because it's both sort of savory and sweet, and it's got just the right amount, and the caramel actually helps like keep all the nuts together so that it's just the perfect texture in your mouth. Like they've done this, like, you know, it's like incredible, right? What else did you say? Twix. Crunchy, again, caramel, chocolate, sweet, cookie, you know, great. So you could justify this on utilitarian principles, and most of us would say that's just creepy. That's just absolutely creepy. To enslave another human being, even though it's a small percentage, to create an enormous amount of happiness is just, it's wrong. It's creepy. A second criticism is, how do you calculate happiness? Again, as you said, what makes me happy might not make you happy. Might terrify you. I have a commercial pilot's license. I own 2 airplanes. One of those airplanes is an acrobatic biplane called a Skybolt. It is a home-built aircraft. It's experimental. And I think it's an enormous amount of fun. Lots of people, you know, like, well, they throw up. You start spinning it and doing loops and rolls, and people throw up. They have inner ear problems. That doesn't sound like fun to them. I think it's great. Other people don't think that's great. They don't think that's fun. A third problem, this is not on the slide, it should be, I forgot to put it, is how many of you have done things that you thought would turn out well and they didn't? You had the best of intentions and it just went horribly astray. Most of you are sitting here in this classroom listening to me yap at you about these ideas and these things that I really like to talk about, because you know that your chances of making a lot of money and being successful are directly, if you weren't born into this, are predicated on your ability to get a good job. And if you want to get a good job, we know that people who go to college statistically make more money than those who don't, on the whole, by and large. Now, you can't get a degree in musical theater. I mean, we have degrees in musical theater. I met somebody the other day that told me they were going to UCO, and I was like, oh, I teach at UCO. What are you getting your degree in? Opera. What are you going to do with that? You're going to hang it on the coffee machine at Starbucks? Because I don't know if you've noticed this, but we don't have an opera here in Oklahoma. And even if we did, you know, how many people are going to be opera singers and make it big? And I mean, it's an infinitesimal amount of people, right? So the fact that you're getting a business degree, that's a wise choice on your part. The fact that you're getting a marketing degree, that's a wise choice. Because marketing is the one field in business that doesn't limit, like accounting, yes, they're gonna get jobs, they're gonna make a decent living, but it's pretty well capped. I mean, accounting doesn't produce revenue. Ultimately, who produces revenue? Sales and marketing produce revenue for the firm. So how do you calculate it, and how is it that we account for things that may not create overall happiness, but you had a really good intent? When I was a kid, my brother and I got up one Saturday or Sunday, I don't remember what it was, and we decided that we were going to surprise our parents by cooking them breakfast. We had the best of intentions. And so we got out the bacon, and we got the eggs, and we were making pancakes. I started cooking at a very young age. And oops, before you know it, bacon, if you've ever cooked bacon, there's a lot of grease. And it's pretty easy, particularly if you have a gas stove, to catch that on fire, right? As the grease is popping out. We had a commercial stove in our house. And the next thing you know, the alarm is going off, the house is full of smoke, and my parents were less than thrilled with that. We had the best of intentions. And it turned out horribly wrong. Nobody was happy. The alarm went off, my parents got up, the kitchen was full of smoke. It took hours to clear out the house. But we had good intentions. A utilitarian would say that was bad because bad results happened. As a result, in order to try and fix this problem, there's a second form of utilitarianism that comes about, and it's called rule utilitarianism. And so what rule utilitarianism tries to do, in the purest form of utilitarianism, what you have to do is in every interaction with another human being, another rational being, you have to attempt to do the calculus. You have to do the heavy lifting of, is this going to produce the greatest happiness overall? Part of the problem with that, let's take a business example. Henry Ford invents, he does not invent the assembly line. Most people credit him with inventing the assembly line. What he does invent is the moving assembly line, where cars go down the factory on a moving assembly line, and this person puts on the tires, and this person assembles the engine to the chassis, and this person puts on a door, and there's and so he invents that, right? But he doesn't invent the assembly line, but he does invent the moving assembly line. He does invent the mass production of automobiles. And so how do you measure whether or not Henry Ford has produced the overall greatest happiness? What is one of the largest contributors to anthropomorphic global warming? Automobiles. Even if you don't believe in anthropomorphic global warming, which I have this friend, it just makes me crazy. He like doesn't believe in anthropomorphic global. He works for the National Weather Service. Doesn't believe in global warming. And he keeps coming up with, I think I told you about him, he keeps coming up with these experts that he says, prove that anthropomorphic global warming doesn't exist. So the last one he sent me is a geologist. And I'm like, Robert, geology is what happens from the surface down. Climate change is what happens from the surface up. this person is not qualified as an expert. And he's like, well, you're not qualified as an expert. I'm like, you're right, I'm not qualified as an expert. What I am qualified to do is to evaluate the research and say, by and large, on the whole, is there more evidence in terms of the amount of research that's done that suggests that this is occurring than not? And he's like, well, if you saw it in these studies, he's like, well, it says the evidence suggests, it doesn't say it's and I'm like, that's the way science works. We don't ever say it's absolutely 100% a fact, right? Because you could get new evidence. But the overwhelming amount of evidence suggests that this is occurring. Now, going back to my Henry Ford example, as a result of not just global warming, but as a result of automobiles, we have a huge number of people that are dying of respiratory illnesses that weren't a problem at the beginning of the 20th century. There are lots of people who are dying of lung cancer that never smoked, because they live in cities that are so polluted that they are exposed to carcinogens just by breathing. How do you weigh that? How do you measure that? Are we happier as a result of the invention of the automobile versus not having the automobile? What was it that we used before the auto? Well, it was horses. I like horses. I've raised, shown horses most of my life. I live in Guthrie. In order to get here at 9:30, if I wanted to ride my horse, what time would I have to leave? Well, I would have had to have left yesterday. My car lets me get here and teach this class, without having to have left yesterday. Why do we have 77 counties in Oklahoma? Well, because they wanted to make it such that you could get to the county seat in every county within a day's ride from the furthest portion of the county. Right? Do we need that many counties now? Probably not, because we've got this thing called the car. I mean, are we overall happier? I don't know. That's really hard. We're doing colossal damage to the environment. And are we all happier? How many of you are absolutely, I like the summertime. It's my favorite. I like summer. I hate winter. I hate being cold. I like going to the lake. I like getting in a swimming pool. I like water. I hate winter. But how many days of 100-degree heat plus did we have this summer? Too many. 7 years ago, we had 67 straight days of over 105-degree temperature. The water lines in Oklahoma City were breaking because the ground was so dry that it shifted so much that it was impacting those water lines. A big component of that is the pollution that we create as a result of cars. How do you calculate that happiness? So in order to come up with a solution to this, we have a second form of utilitarianism that comes about. It's called rule utilitarianism. So the primary form is act utilitarianism, and then we have rule. So the rule utilitarianism attempts to deal with this problem of, I thought I was doing a good thing by making breakfast for my parents. It turned out it was really, really bad. So what it says is that we'll produce rules that in the aggregate produce the greatest amount of happiness. They may not produce the greatest happiness in a specific instance, but in the aggregate, we're going to try and produce the greatest amount of happiness. So this could be illustrated by the hypothetical of the serial killer, right? Suppose that there's a police officer out there that knows the identity of a serial killer fairly substantially, right? And he knows that he doesn't have enough evidence to arrest the serial killer because it's all circumstantial. This guy is really, really smart. There was a television program about a character like this called Dexter, if you watched it. It was about a serial killer, but he was a sociopath or a psychopath, and his father basically trained him to kill only other people who were killers, right? That's how he got, sort of an ethical aspect to it. So he was killing other serial killers. He works for the police department as a blood splatter analyst. His sister's a police officer. If you've ever watched the show, it was kind of an interesting show. I watched it for a number of years. And so he's killing he's killing other killers. But he's really smart. And so he gets away with all this. Let's suppose that the police discover this. Now, in an act utilitarian perspective, they would be justified in just killing that individual because you're going to risk using enormous amounts of resources on somebody that may or may not be convicted. And even if he is convicted, well, then he's going to get an appeal, right? Everybody has a right to at least one appeal in most states, right? Murder is a state crime, by the way. It's not a federal crime for the most part. And there are some federal murder crimes, but for the most part, it's a state crime unless you commit murder in the District of Columbia or on an Air Force base or a military installation or something like that. It's a state crime. In most states, you get at least one appeal. In many states, you get more than that. Not in Oklahoma. We have what's called the rocket docket to the death chamber. Here in Oklahoma, we're fascinated by the death penalty. We only have one court of appeals for criminals, and it's called the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. Don't call it the Oklahoma Criminal Court of Appeals because that implies that the court itself is criminal, right? It's the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. We're one of only two states that have what's called a bifurcated Supreme Court. So our top Supreme Court for criminal matters is the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. In civil matters, we have the Oklahoma Supreme Court. Texas is the other state that has a bifurcated system. But even in Texas, they have intermediate courts of appeals that will hear it. So you have an appeal of right to the intermediate court of appeals, and then you have a second appeal to, not in Oklahoma, one appeal. That's it. That's all you get. To the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. Rocket docket. To the death chamber. But in most places, you have at least one appeal. Should the police officer, knowing that this is going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to prosecute, and he may or may not be convicted, should he go ahead and kill the individual? Well, a rule utilitarian would say no. Why? Because even though in the instance of killing that serial killer, killing Dexter, you might produce overall greater happiness because you've stopped a serial killer, you've saved the state a lot of money. If the people thought that this was happening, there was a movie about this, and they've remade the movie, by the way. It was called Judge Dredd, was the first one that I watched. I think Sylvester Stallone starred in the original one. The premise is that the police are judge, jury, and executioner all in one. If somebody commits a crime, the police stop the individual. They say, citizens, stop. You will be judged. And if they are found guilty by the police officer, they're executed right there. What happens in that movie is that people are naturally skeptical of the police. And so we could argue that, although our system of government and its respect for the rule of law is cumbersome, by and large, on the whole, people respect the police. They believe that the police are there to help them. Again, by and large, on the whole. And so they tell the police things, right? If you had this system where you thought the police were corrupt and they were just killing people indiscriminately, you might not talk to them. So what is the antithesis of utilitarian ethics? It's deontological ethics. There are two forms, just as there are two forms of utilitarianism, there are two forms of duty ethics: religious absolutism and rational absolutism. Religious absolutism, what we're going to do is we're going to turn to the book. Now, there are lots of problems with this, right? So if we look at the book, for example, if we say this is a Judeo-Christian nation, what does the book say? Well, let's take an example from the book. If a man lays with a man as he does with a woman, they have both committed an abomination. Their blood shall surely be upon them. Leviticus 18:20. Seems pretty clear to me. If we just take a face reading of the Bible, a few lines above and below Leviticus 18:20, we're told that it's an abomination to eat a shrimp. It's an abomination to wear linen and wool together. It's an abomination to plant two crops in the same field. Are we gonna stone all of you who've eaten a shrimp? How many of you like, I hate seafood, don't eat it. Can't stand it. We're gonna stone all of you people that, how many of you like shrimp? Most people do. Just love shrimp. I don't understand it. It's chewy. It's got a gritty texture to it. In response to that, we get rational absolutism. This is developed by Immanuel Kant. What Kant says, so Kant's three greatest works are a critique of practical reason, a critique of pure reason, and the metaphysics of morals. In a critique of practical reason, Kant says that there are hypothetical imperatives. What's a hypothetical imperative? I want to get a good job, therefore I'm going to go to college. That's why you're here. Right? That's a hypothetical imperative. It may or may not have moral import. There's nothing wrong. It's like this desire to make a good living is neither moral or immoral. As long as you are not a burden on anybody else, that has very little moral import, whether or not you get a good job and make a lot of money, right? Now, as I approach, I am in the twilight of my career here. I can retire at 55 from UCO, draw my teacher's retirement. Got a countdown clock to that day. I started teaching here when I was 22 years old. I loved it. It was, but now, like, I've gotten old and cranky. There is no real moral imperative to you getting a good job. If you are not being a burden on anybody else, but you're not producing a huge amount of money, wealth, that's very little moral import. I hope you all do, because my Social Security benefits are predicated on you paying in to Social Security, right? Which I can draw at 62. Very little moral import. That's a categorical, or that's a hypothetical imperative. Things with moral import are covered under a categorical imperative. Kant says we can't look at whether or not the ends turn out well. We have to discern the rules a priori using the rational mind. And I'm out of time, so we'll catch up with this next time. You got ducks, come and see me. Let me stop before you come up here, let me stop the video. To